on me as to why Duke never really gets any sort of mainstream attention or any sort of recognition at all. I mean, they play in the ACC and they've really done a phenomenal job this year with their first year under Manny Diaz. I mean, I certainly wasn't sitting there saying that they would go 9-3 this year, being being 6-1 in their games of one possession or less. They've done a phenomenal job on that front too. And I guess in many ways, Duke almost reminds me of Iowa football in the sense of, okay, their main bread and butter or their identity is primarily on the defensive side of the ball. You have a really strong linebacking core, a solid secondary that doesn't give up too many plays, but they actually have a competent quarterback in Malik Murphy. He was a transfer from Texas. Then now they brought in Menza from Tulane, who I think everyone should be really excited about. Has a very similar skill set to Murphy, and I think that transition is going to be pretty seamless in many regard because you sit there and say to yourself in terms of Duke, if you go back, let's say even 15, 17 years ago, you remember the days of Ted Roof. I don't want to give too many people out there too many bad memories, but you think of Ted Roof, who won one ACC game in I think it was 3 seasons, and then fast forward, they hired David Cutcliffe, who was the head coach at Ole Miss before he made his way to Duke, and he was there for about 15 seasons, brought some legitimacy to the program, and then once when he finished his tenure with 3 losing seasons, it was kind of time to transition to Mike Elko. Mike Elko ends up going to Texas A&M, and then you end up with Manny Diaz. So Manny Diaz is really a solid coach. I mean, he's the type of guy that I think 5 years from now we're going to be talking about him at one of the premier programs in all of college football too. And even you sit there and say too, like you've never really questioned his coaching ability. It's more or less him finding the right opportunity too. And Duke always gets the rap about being a basketball school or whatnot too, but even still, they've shown some success over the years. I mean, even if you want to go back to last year when they were starting Riley Leonard, they were as high as 16 in the AP poll. They had they averaged one of the highest scoring offenses in all of football, even though the consistency of that is definitely questionable. Needless to say, I mean, even if you go back and look at the SMU game, for example, they lost that game in overtime, but quite frankly, that's a game that should have gotten to 10 wins. You sat there and said, "Wow, SMU had over five turnovers in that game." Duke's defense played as well as they could have, and they still ended up with the loss there. But even if you go back and look at their schedule, I mean, one of the biggest games of the year for them is always North Carolina, and they just squeaked by there. I remember watching the Northwestern game at the beginning of the season where that game went into overtime. Talking about a comedy of errors in that game for those of you who remember that game. Yeah, that game was definitely pretty fun to watch. And then they did their thing the rest of the season. They took care of business versus Wake Forest when now we know that's Dave Clawson's last game. So shout out to him. And then they beat you. They have some other solid wins versus UConn, Virginia Tech, and North Carolina State. But you sit there and wonder, where does Duke go from here? 9-3 record this year, 5-3 in ACC play, and just outside the top 25 poll. I was almost a little bit surprised that they weren't ranked by the end of the season, given that if you look at really everything, that's been happening for them, I mean, you're definitely a little bit surprised too when you're top 30 in points in the nation. You have some sort of culture and identity now, which is definitely heading in the right direction. But you look at Duke and you say to yourself, okay, you have your quarterback this year. You are definitely going to lose a bunch of seniors this year. So I think the team is going to be a little bit younger than what we've seen in years past. But it's a big testament to what Duke has accomplished compared to, the Ted Roof era and the beginning of the Cutcliffe era to now what we've seen with having Mike Elko pretty much immediately turn the Duke program around in 2 seasons. Then you have Manny Diaz, who's won 9. I sit there and say to myself, can Duke put together a season that gets them a 10-win season? And I think they could be a legitimate dark horse in the ACC. I still think there's some question marks on the offense side of the ball. In terms of recruiting, they're ranked number 33 right now, and they've definitely had success, particularly in North Carolina, and they're 6th in the ACC right now. So things are trending in the right direction too. Because I have to tell you too, with the conception of it being primarily a basketball school and the academic rigor that it requires to be at Duke, sometimes your recruiting pool is just simply limited, and that's one of the things that you kind of always have to keep in mind in terms of these sort of programs like a Duke or Purdue or any those type of examples. But moving forward, Duke's in a pretty solid spot, because if you look at the rest of the ACC, a lot of them are kind of in sort of a, not a rebuild, but they're not in that upper echelon like Duke has the potential to be. I mean, you look at the rest of the schedule that I just rounded off. I think North Carolina State, as long as Dave Doran's there, is in pretty much the epiphany of mediocre. Talented teams every year, but just hasn't put up results. You look at Virginia Tech, and Brett Pryce is not very competent in terms of clock management. You look at Wake Forest, and I think it's going to take a couple years for Jake Dickett to really put together a formidable squad there. So I know that's going to take a while. Then you look at the rest of the ACC. SMU is obviously going to be a force to be reckoned with now that they have a lot of NIL and endowment money and collectives coming in. So I think they're definitely going to be a pretty big threat to the ACC moving forward. Obviously, you always have to worry about Miami, but again, Mario Cristobal, he recruits his ass off. But then when you see the results on the field, you kind of just sit there and second guess yourself there. And then I think Georgia Tech I would argue, would be the other sort of dark horse in the ACC. But right now, Duke's in a really good spot, all things considered. When you even go down memory lane and you sit there and look at their 2024 class, you sit there and say, okay, they were ranked in the top. I think they were 45th in recruiting for 2024, and in 2023 they were 57th. So everything is trending in the right direction too, and especially in this day and age of college football, where everyone expects everything to happen overnight, Duke should definitely get some credit for that. And when you move forward from here, the defense has never been a question. In fact, I think defense should be the identity of the program, should be the identity of the team. That's clearly the strength of the team. And if I were them, I would just simply double down on that. I think too much. I think there were a lot of times where it was almost like they just wanted it to be more about Malik Murphy and Jordan Moore, who I also think is a phenomenal weapon at wide receiver. But if you're Duke, I'm like, just double down on just having a brilliant defense, particularly at the linebacking core. Definitely have to improve on having a little bit more of a balanced rushing attack. I mean, their leading rusher to 870 yards this year. And then when you look at Malik Murphy too, I mean, I'm really happy for him that he even just got the opportunity to be able to show that he can do his thing. Because as long as he was at Texas, he was just going to be behind the depth chart too. And when you throw over 26 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, and just shy of 3,000 yards, you sit there and say to yourself, man, you definitely have to be super happy that you get a kid like that too. Because even at Texas, you saw the little parts of having that potential, but it just seemed like he never got the chance. And Duke, to me, really seems like one of those places where that would be the selling point if I were Duke. If you asked me, like, what's your pitch in terms of Duke, you sit there and say to yourself, no matter what your NFL aspirations are, you're going to get a great degree here. You have a great coaching staff around you with Manny Diaz. I think obviously one of the questions is how long will he stay there for, because obviously Mike Elko just took the job at Texas A&M, but you have that consistency with David Cutcliffe too, so you can always sell that part of it. Right now you're taking care of business versus North Carolina, and you play in one of the most respectable conferences in all of college football in the ACC. I know people are talking about how Florida State and Clemson are talked about leaving or whatever, but at the same time, there's so much history and prestige and relevance to that I think that's another selling point about Duke football that goes under the radar. And for going into 2025, I'm curious to see how Duke does, particularly in the transfer portal, in the sense of not even so much how much resources can go in there, because I think the athletic director and chancellor and the president there have shown that they are willing to put more of a commitment to football. Now, obviously, I'm not saying it's going to be as much as basketball, but they're slowly working their way towards building a very formidable program there. And I think people should be on the lookout for Duke football moving